It was a Tuesday night, or maybe Wednesday. Ethan had stopped keeping track. He sat in his aging Toyota Corolla, parked under a flickering streetlight outside a rundown laundromat. The engine was off, but he didn't get out. The air inside the car felt heavy, still warm from the day, and smelled faintly of sweat, fast food, and defeat. His phone lay face down in the passenger seat, buzzing every few minutes. Late bill reminders, unread messages from his landlord, and a push notification from a budgeting app he downloaded months ago and never opened again. In his lap sat a shutoff notice from the electric company. Final warning. He'd read it 3 times already, but the words still managed to knock the wind out of him. It wasn't just the overdue balance. It was what it represented, another in a long line of things slipping through his fingers. Outside, the street was quiet except for the distant hum of a bus engine and the occasional hiss of tires on wet asphalt. Inside his chest, though, it was chaos, doubt, shame, exhaustion, and that sharp, sinking ache of not knowing how much lower things could go. Just 2 years ago, he was pitching investors. He had a slide deck, a co-founder, and a dream of launching an app that disrupted the way freelancers got paid. He remembered the buzzwords. He remembered the meetings where they nodded, sipped espresso, and asked about scalability. He even remembered the one investor who said, "You've got something here." That investor ghosted him 3 weeks later. Now his co-founder was working at a fintech firm in Austin. And Ethan was delivering groceries for a same-day delivery app under a fake name, just to avoid running into anyone he knew. He hadn't told his parents, not because they wouldn't understand, but because they'd already given him so much too much. His mom had emptied a savings account to help him cover his rent last winter. His dad had driven cross-state to help him move out when he couldn't afford the lease anymore. He couldn't bear to tell them that now he was sleeping on a friend's couch most nights and eating peanut butter straight from the jar on others. He looked at himself in the rearview mirror. The bags under his eyes were deeper than he remembered. His beard was uneven, patchy in places he used to shave clean. His hoodie, once a startup grind badge of honor, was now threadbare at the cuffs. This wasn't burnout, it was erosion. He reached for the glove box and pulled out a crumpled receipt. Gas station. 12.19. The number startled him. He had less than 30 left in his checking account. Rent was due in 5 days. His credit cards were maxed out. He hadn't checked his credit score in months. She didn't need to. He knew it was bad. A lump formed in his throat. That familiar pressure of guilt and helplessness that crept in late at night when everything was quiet. He hated this version of himself. Hated how he froze when he should act. How he avoided reality by refreshing Twitter or watching YouTube videos about rich habits without applying any of them. But most of all, he hated how ordinary his failure felt. Not cinematic, not tragic, just quiet and slow. Like watching milk go bad. He rested his head on the steering wheel and whispered to himself, not in desperation, but in recognition, "This can't be all there is." And in that moment, something shifted, not a breakthrough, not hope, but a kind of stillness. A silence that wrapped itself around the noise and said, "You're not done yet." He didn't know what the next step was, but he knew this wasn't it. There had to be something more than just surviving. There had to be a way out that didn't involve another hack or hollow motivational quote. Somewhere deep inside the ache, a single thought flickered. What if I stopped trying to be impressive and just tried to be free? Ethan didn't sleep that night. He tried, closed his eyes, rolled to one side, then the other. But his thoughts had grown teeth. Every time he drifted off, they bit down late payments, missed calls, conversations he was avoiding. The walls of his friend's spare room felt too thin, the mattress too low, the quiet too loud. Around 4:00 a.m., he got up and sat by the tiny window staring out at nothing. a city that never quite slept, but never really noticed him either. He couldn't remember the last time he felt proud of anything. Everything he once called ambition now looked like poor judgment in hindsight. The startup, the pitch events, the fancy co-working spaces he couldn't afford but showed up at anyway, ordering overpriced lattes just to feel like he belonged. He used to tell himself he was building something. But he'd built a house of glass and, when it cracked, there was nothing beneath it. No savings, no backup plan. Just him and his ability to talk his way into temporary gigs. On Instagram, old friends posted smiling photos from Dubai and Tulum. "Work hard, play harder," the captions read. He knew some of them were fronting credit card debt hiding behind palm tree emojis. But it still stung. He wasn't even pretending anymore. He had nothing to show. No pictures, no trips, no big win post. Just 3 unread eviction warnings and a prepaid phone plan he refilled with tip money. Comparison was its own kind of poverty, a poverty of the soul. It wasn't just the money, it was what the money represented: autonomy, stability, dignity. He hated how money dictated everything now. Whether he could go home for the holidays, whether he could say yes to dinner, whether he could fix his cracked phone screen, or keep pretending it didn't bother him. And underneath all of it was the shame. He remembered sitting in his college economics class, nodding along as the professor explained compound interest. He remembered reading Rich Dad, Poor Dad at 18 and swearing he'd be the one who figured it all out early. "I'll never be like them," he'd said, referring to his parents, who always paid bills late and lived month to month. And yet, here he was, 30 steps behind where they were at his age. His dad had 2 kids and a mortgage by 29. Ethan had 3 used laptops, a bag of instant noodles, and a resume full of maybes. He felt it most when his friends invited him out. He'd make excuse too tired, got work early, not feeling well, but the truth was simpler. He couldn't afford it, not just financially, but emotionally. Sitting there watching them order 18 cocktails and laugh about rough weeks at the office only reminded him how far he'd drifted. He was no longer part of the conversation, just a background character politely fading from the frame. But it wasn't always this way. There had been a time brief, yes, but real, when he felt alive. Building the prototype. Staying up until 2:00 a.m. Not because he had to, but because he believed in something. That feeling of flow, of purpose. It didn't last, but it had tasted like possibility. He wanted that again, but this time, not built on illusion. Still, every time he tried to imagine a way forward, it all felt complicated. Save? How? He was barely surviving. Invest? In what? He didn't have thousands lying around. Budget? With what money? He wasn't even sure what a normal month looked like anymore. His financial life felt like a house that had burned down, and now people were handing him blueprints saying, "Just build it back." But beneath the frustration, beneath the sarcasm and self-pity, there was something softer. A question he hadn't allowed himself to ask out loud. What if I've been doing this wrong the whole time? Not just wrong in strategy, but wrong in belief, in what he thought wealth looked like, what success meant, what freedom actually was. Because for all his dreaming and all his trying, he'd never once felt free. And deep down, he knew that's what he was really after. Not a Tesla, not a title, just the ability to breathe without fear, to walk into a coffee shop and not panic when the total was higher than expected, to say no to a job offer and not wonder if it would ruin him, to be free in the quiet, invisible ways that actually mattered. He looked back down at his phone. The battery was dying. 1 bar left. He didn't charge it, not yet. Instead, he opened his notes app and typed a single question. What does enough actually look like? He didn't know the answer. But for the first time in a long time, he was finally asking the right question. A few days later, Ethan found himself at a library. Not for a book. Not really. He just needed a warm place to sit where no one would ask questions. His freelance app had glitched that morning, no gigs. His prepaid phone had run out of data again. And after pacing the city for 2 hours trying to clear his head, he wandered into the old branch near his high school, more out of muscle memory than intention. The building smelled like paper and quiet. He used to come here after school, back when everything still felt like it was going somewhere. Back when he believed knowledge was the key to unlocking a good life. That belief felt like a childhood myth now. He slumped into one of the cracked faux leather chairs near the personal finance section, not because he was looking for anything specific, but because it was empty and quiet. He scrolled through his phone on borrowed Wi-Fi until the screen blinked red battery dying. Sighing, he glanced at the shelves beside him. Rows of dusty spines, titles that felt both hopeful and insulting. Get Rich Slowly, Millionaire Teacher, Retire Early, Live Free. He almost rolled, his eyes almost stood up to leave, but one thin paperback caught his attention. The cover wasn't flashy. No gold bars or grinning businessmen. Just a forest trail and a quiet title, The Simple Path to Wealth. Something about it made him pause. He pulled it down, flipped open to a random chapter, and started reading. At first, it sounded like every other financial book he'd ever skimmed talk about index funds, retirement accounts, saving rates. He skimmed faster. Then a sentence caught him. You own the things you buy, and eventually they own you. He stopped. It wasn't revolutionary. It wasn't even new, but somehow it landed different. He thought of the gadgets in his storage bin, the clothes he barely wore, the 80 headphones he bought during a week when he couldn't afford groceries. He thought of the couch he financed for an apartment he no longer lived in. He read more. No upsells, no complex charts, no promises of Lamborghinis or 7-figure portfolios in 18 months. Just quiet, clear logic. Live below your means, avoid debt, invest consistently, and let time work its magic. Ethan closed the book, then opened it again, this time, slower. He wasn't ready to believe in it yet, not fully. There was still a voice inside that said, "This won't work for people like you. You're too late, too broke, too far gone." But another voice, quieter, steadier, said, "What if it's not too late? What if this was the way out all along, and you were just looking in the wrong direction?" It was like a fog lifted. Not all at once, and not clearly, but just enough to see the road underneath. He remembered the quote again, the one that stuck. Ownership, simplicity, agency. Not chasing the shiny, but choosing the steady. He borrowed the book, tucked it into his backpack. On the way out, he passed a young couple in their early 20s laughing, holding hands, oblivious to the world. He smiled, not in bitterness, but in curiosity. He wondered what their financial lives looked like, if they even thought about retirement, if anyone their age did. That night, back at his friend's place, he stayed up reading under a weak desk lamp. He didn't understand all the terminology, expense ratios, 401k matches, tax-advantaged accounts, but he didn't need to, not yet. What mattered was the message beneath the math. You can buy your freedom, not with speed, not with luck, but with patience. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't fast, but it was honest. And after everything he'd been through, Ethan realized something. He was done chasing impressive. He was ready to chase peace. Ethan didn't become a different person overnight. By the time he returned the book to the library, he had 3 pages of handwritten notes folded in his back pocket, scribbles, quotes, questions. He didn't fully understand the math, and truthfully, he didn't trust it either. A part of him still believed it was too good to be true, that maybe the simple path to wealth only worked for people with six-figure salaries and childhoods that came with trust funds and paid-off cars. He looked at his life and thought, how can I invest when I can barely pay rent? How can I save when everything is already overdue? The doubt clung to him like damp clothes. And yet, he couldn't ignore how different this felt from everything else he'd tried. This wasn't a 10x your income hustle. It wasn't another YouTube guru in front of a rented Lamborghini. It was calm, almost boring, but somehow believable. And maybe believable was what he needed most right now. He started noticing things he never used to. The vending machine at work, $2.25 for a soda he didn't even enjoy. The rideshare apps he used out of habit. The streaming services that auto-renewed every month for shows he never watched. It wasn't about shame. It was about clarity. A slow unraveling of noise. Each small thing he questioned became a mirror. Do I really need this? Or am I buying the feeling of being okay for 5 minutes? He didn't delete anything right away. That wasn't his style. He just started paying attention. He began walking more, partly to save money, partly because he needed to think. Long, aimless walks through quiet neighborhoods he couldn't afford to live in. As he passed rows of front yards with motion lights and holiday wreaths, he didn't feel envy, he felt curiosity. Who lived behind those doors? How did they get there? Did they follow this simple path, or did they just get lucky? One night, walking home from a shift, he stopped at a small corner store to grab dinner. Normally, he wouldn't think twice pre-packed sandwich, iced tea, maybe a candy bar. But this time, he paused. He looked at the label. 11.79. Not outrageous, but something in him flinched. He put it back. Not because he couldn't afford it, though he was cutting it close, but because, for the first time, he asked himself, what am I actually paying for here? Convenience? Sugar? Numbness? He went home and made oatmeal. It wasn't a moment worth posting about. But to him, it felt like a rebellion. Still, there were days he slipped. Impulse buys. Emotional eating. One Friday night, after a rough week, he ordered 27 worth of sushi delivery. He regretted it immediately, not because of the calories or the cost, but because the feeling it gave him didn't last even halfway through the meal. It was a high followed by a crash, a craving, not a choice. He started journaling not for therapy, just to untangle his mind. He wrote about what freedom meant to him, not the kind sold in commercials, but the kind where you didn't have to say yes out of fear, where a missed paycheck didn't equal a panic attack, where sleep wasn't haunted by what-ifs. Slowly, his internal language changed. He no longer said, I'm broke. He started saying, I'm rebuilding. He stopped saying, I can't afford that, and started asking, is this aligned with where I'm going? It was subtle, invisible to anyone watching, but to him, it felt seismic. One night, as he read back through his notes, he underlined a phrase from the book that now pulsed in his brain like a heartbeat. Stop thinking about what you can't control. Start thinking about what you can choose. The next morning, he opened his banking app not to panic, but to observe. He looked at his last 30 transactions. He grouped them into want and need. The numbers didn't lie. His shame tried to crawl back in, but this time, he didn't let it lead. He simply noted. With a quiet nod, he whispered, okay, this is where I start. Not with a raise, not with a windfall, just with awareness. That weekend, he made a list. Cancel music app? Yes. Sell old electronics? Try Craigslist. Open a basic brokerage account? Research Vanguard. It wasn't exciting, but it was his. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan didn't feel like a victim of his finances. He felt like a participant. The first time Ethan transferred money into his new brokerage account, he half expected his phone to buzz with confetti or a congratulatory email. But all he got was a bland message. You've successfully purchased 100 of VTI. No fireworks, no chime, no pop-up saying, "Congratulations, you're on your way to freedom." Just a confirmation and a silence. He stared at the screen for a while, unsure of what he had expected. He knew what he'd hoped for, a feeling of momentum maybe, a psychological reward. Something to mark the fact that for the first time in his adult life, he wasn't just surviving the present, he was investing in a future. Instead, it felt like nothing, and somehow that made it even more profound. The next few days weren't glamorous either. He started packing lunches in old Tupperware containers. At work, the guys on his shift joked when he declined fast food. "What? You on a budget now?" one teased. "Yeah," Ethan replied without a smirk. "Trying to keep my wallet alive." He said it lightly, but the truth was heavier. He'd never felt poorer than when he was spending without control. And now, oddly, each time he chose not to spend, he felt lighter, in charge, not rich, not even comfortable, but for once, intentional. He made a list he titled, 10 Decisions That Made Me Poor. Late-night Ubers when he could have walked. That monthly subscription to a design app he hadn't opened since March. Impulse buys at checkout lines. Treat yourself dinners that turned into regret before the bill hit the table. They weren't big things. That's what made them dangerous. They were tiny leaks in a boat already struggling to float. He started plugging them one by one. Every canceled subscription felt like a quiet win. Every second-hand item he sold on Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace added to his little emergency fund. Not a fortress, but a foothold. And slowly, the fear began to change shape. He used to wake up panicked, wondering what bill he forgot, which payment would bounce, whether his card would be declined again in front of strangers. Now, he still felt pressure, but it was different. Quieter. It no longer screamed. It whispered, "Keep going." One of the most surprisingly difficult changes was social. Saying no to plans with friends didn't get easier just because it was necessary. Every group dinner invitation came with a calculation, not just dollars, but emotional bandwidth. Would he feel embarrassed again? Would he have to lie and say he'd already eaten? One night, when asked to meet up, he replied, "Rain check this time, tight week." There was a pause. Then his friend texted back, "No worries, come next time. Let's hang soon regardless." It wasn't rejection. It wasn't shame. It was normal. And that one text felt like oxygen. He realized he had been projecting more judgment on himself than anyone else was placing on him. And that was freeing too. At home, he posted a sticky note on the wall. "I don't need to impress. I need to be free." It became a filter for every purchase. Every yes, every no. That same week, his bank sent him a credit card offer with a 5-0 limit and a 0% intro APR. The old Ethan would have jumped, used it to get ahead, clear some debt, upgrade something, breathe a little. But this, Ethan, saw the trap. He shredded the letter. Instead, he put 20 into his brokerage account. Just 20. It didn't feel like much, but it felt like a vote for the future he was choosing. A slow rebellion against everything the world said he needed to be happy. And there was something else. He began writing again. Not blog posts, not startup ideas, just thoughts, observations, gratitudes. One night, he wrote, "Today I walked 4 miles, spent 0, invested 10, and slept with a clear mind. That used to be a bad day. Now, it's a win." He wasn't healed. He wasn't rich. He still had moments of doubt, especially on the harder days when the numbers didn't seem to move. But now, those moments didn't spiral. Because every small activity-packed lunch, every delayed impulse, every dollar invested was proof of something more powerful than income. Progress. Spring came slowly that year, like it was waiting on Ethan. He had moved into a smaller apartment, really just a room with a kitchenette and a single window that overlooked a brick alleyway. It wasn't pretty. It had no dishwasher, the floors creaked, and the radiator hissed like it was tired of working. But it was his. The lease was modest. The utilities were manageable. He no longer felt like he was living in borrowed time or borrowed space. It felt like a beginning. He painted one wall a soft gray and found an old bookshelf on the sidewalk, which he sanded and stained by hand. He filled it not with startup books or flashy get-rich manifestos, but with things that now felt holy: simplicity, peace, time, tested wisdom, your money or your life, the psychology of money. The simple path to wealth, of course well-worn, bookmarked, and now permanently his. Mornings became sacred. He would wake before the city, sit on a thrifted cushion by the window with a chipped mug of black coffee, and write in silence, not to be productive, not to get ahead, just to meet himself where he was. Some entries were no longer than a sentence. Others rambled for pages. "I am not in a rush today. I spent nothing yesterday and still felt full. I said no to something that wasn't for me and the world didn't end." There was no drama to this life, no rags to riches montage, just days stacked quietly, honestly like bricks that no longer wobbled beneath his feet. His emergency fund hit 2-0, then 3-500. He began calling it his freedom pile, not because it could buy him everything, but because it bought him space. Space between chaos and choice, between I have to and I get to. He no longer checked his brokerage account every day. He checked it once a week, then once a month, watching the balance grow, not by magic, but by design. He had invested 200-300 by then, just enough for the returns to start whispering, just enough to feel like the future wasn't a threat anymore. He started going on long walks without headphones, listening to birds, the sound of his own breath. At first it was awkward, like meeting someone you forgot you knew. But soon it became peace. The world no longer moved too fast. He had simply slowed down enough to catch up to it. He reconnected with old friends, not the ones who needed to be impressed, but the ones who had always been real. Over cheap coffee or free museum days, they talked about life, about how none of them had it figured out, and how maybe that was okay. He started cooking for himself again. Not just eggs and toast, but real food. Food that took time, stirring soup slowly, kneading dough with his bare hands, singing along to old music on the radio. These weren't just meals, they were rituals. And in them, he rediscovered joy. One Saturday morning, he sat across from his mother in her tiny kitchen. She had noticed something in him, not money, not success, something softer, something more solid. "You look lighter," she said. He smiled. "I think I am." And he meant it. The weight wasn't gone, but he was no longer carrying it alone. He had systems now. He had habits. He had awareness. And with those came a kind of confidence that couldn't be faked internal security that no salary could buy. He had learned to say no, to hurry, to fear, to shame, to people who only showed up when he had something to prove. And in that no, he found his yes. Yes to stillness. Yes to patience. Yes, to a life that didn't demand everything from him to feel worthwhile. The biggest surprise? He didn't miss his old goals. Not the hustle, not the grind, not the chase. He had spent years trying to escape something: poverty, obscurity, irrelevance. But now, he wasn't running anymore. He was choosing. Every dollar he didn't spend was a brick in the foundation of a life he actually wanted. Not flashy, but firm. Not loud, but lasting. And somewhere along the way, Ethan realized this wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about becoming the kind of person who could hold peace in his palms and not crush it out of fear. It wasn't a grand milestone that marked the transformation. No sudden windfall. No viral tweet about his financial comeback. No standing ovation or slow-motion scenes. Just a morning quiet and clear when Ethan realized he hadn't thought about money all week. He was sitting on a bench outside his favorite neighborhood cafe. He didn't go there often, it was still a treat, but today he ordered a single black coffee and paid in cash. Not because he had to, but because it reminded him of what it felt like to be intentional. That old feeling of dread, of watching the card reader with bated breath, praying it wouldn't decline, that feeling had faded. Now there was room. Room to breathe. Room to choose. Room to look up and see the world, instead of just surviving inside it. He checked his email while sipping his coffee. Nothing urgent. A part-time opportunity at a community center he'd volunteered with. No benefits. Modest pay. But meaningful work. Work he could say yes to because he no longer needed a six-figure paycheck to feel safe. He tapped reply, smiled, and typed, "I'm available Mondays and Thursdays. Let's talk more." That was the real luxury. Not time off, but time on his terms. Later that week, his 17-year-old nephew came to visit. A lanky, eager kid with earbuds in and big plans to get rich by 25. Dropshipping, crypto, NFTs, the whole internet package. He paced around Ethan's kitchen, explaining the newest hustle, the TikTok guru who promised fast success, the car he planned to lease when he blew up. Ethan didn't lecture. He just listened. Let the kid burn through his excitement. Then, while pouring them each a glass of water, he reached into the drawer and pulled out a folded sheet, faded, worn at the creases. His original notes, From the Simple Path to Wealth. He slid the paper across the table. "I don't expect you to get it now," he said softly. "But one day, you might want something quieter than more, something steadier. When that day comes, this helped me." His nephew barely looked at it. Shrugged. Changed the subject. Ethan didn't mind. He had done the same at that age. Some truths arrive like thunder, others like seeds. That night, Ethan lay in bed listening to the rain. It used to make him anxious. Rain meant leaks, delays, broken things he couldn't afford to fix. But now, it just sounded like rhythm, like grace. His investments weren't massive, but they were consistent. His debt was gone. His needs were few. His life was his. He no longer chased milestones. Instead, he counted moments. Like cooking dinner without checking his bank balance. Like sleeping in on Sundays without guilt. Like walking past a new phone display and realizing genuinely that he didn't want it. These weren't sacrifices. They were preferences. Not because he couldn't afford more, but because he discovered what enough actually meant. And enough was everything. He thought back to his lowest point that night in the car, staring at the shutoff notice. That version of him felt like someone he used to know. Someone who had to break in order to rebuild. Who had to lose the noise to finally hear the signal. And now? Now he could help others without resentment. Love without condition. Live without needing permission. There were still days of doubt, of course. Times when the world whispered, "You should want more." But he knew the truth now. More wasn't always better. Better was better. And he had better. Right here. Right now. He turned off the lamp, pulled the blanket over his chest, and whispered to himself the same words he once wrote on a sticky note all those years ago. "I don't need to impress. I need to be free." He smiled. And he slept. Not because everything was perfect, but because finally he was.